Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Welcome and happy Earth Day. Thanks for celebrating your Earth Day with us. This is the Global Adaptation Month webinar hosted by EcoAdapt National Adaptation Forum team in partnership with Center for Sustainable Communities. Global Adaptation Month is an initiative aimed at advancing action, awareness, and accountability for the field of climate adaptation. We encourage you to visit www.globaladaptationmonth.org to learn more and share your commitment to climate adaptation action with us today. I'm Molly Johnson. I'm coordinator of Global Adaptation Month, and I'll be your organizer for today's webinar called To Act and Adapt Faith-Based Adaptation Town Hall. Before we get started, I'd like to go through some housekeeping rules with you all just to ensure a successful webinar. So please place your telephone, cell phone, or computer on mute. This will help reduce feedback. If you're using microphone voice over IP option, please ensure you place your computer on mute, even if you are listed as muted when you logged in. We will have time after the panel for question and answers. So throughout the webinar, you can use the question function to submit any questions to our presenters, and we will do our best to answer them, all of them. We also recognize there are many diverse faith traditions beyond those represented on this panel. We encourage you to share your own faith perspective with us in the question box and help nourish today's discussion. Please also use the question function to report any technical issues you may encounter, and my team will help you address those issues to ensure you have a favorable webinar experience. Finally, we will be recording and posting this webinar in the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange website for future viewing, and you can find that at www.cakex.org. So thank you all for being here. And with that said, I'm really pleased to introduce today's moderator, Juliette Hall. Juliette is a recognized and respected advisor, leadership consultant, and speaker. She is the principal of Juliette Hall, Inc., a leadership consulting firm based in Atlanta, Georgia. Juliette worked as a corporate agent for 20 years, most notably with Chick-fil-A, and she currently mobilizes individuals to discover themselves, develop their unique abilities, and dominate their sphere of authority according to their specialized areas of gifting. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Juliette to lead us in today's session.
Thank you, Molly, and happy Earth Day to everyone. I want to welcome each of you and pray that you all listening today are keeping yourselves safe, sound, and socially distanced. I bring you virtual greetings from my home in Atlanta, Georgia, as we recognize the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. It's game on, everybody, game on for adaptation. And in recognition of Global Adaptation Month, we are excited to convene a panel of faith-based leaders to discuss the role of faith in climate change. Today, the purpose of this town hall is to engage a conversation among the unique gathering of faith-based leaders with the purpose of informing and inspiring individuals to build resilience to climate change impacts physically, mentally, and spiritually. We want you to leave this town hall empowered with knowledge of climate change and adaptation, with hope for a sustainable future, and inspired to take action in your congregation and communities. If time permits, we will have an opportunity for Q&A, so please enter your questions to the questions box available in your control panel. At this time, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. Beginning with the Reverend Dr. Ambrose Carroll. He is one of the nation's premier practical theologians. He is the founder of Green the Church, a national organization that exists to be a repository and a catalyst for sustainable practices at the intersection of the environmental movement and the Black church. Dr. Carroll also serves as the senior pastor of the Church by the Side of the Road and is vice president at large of the California State Baptist Convention, which is the largest body of Black Baptists in the state of California. Next, we have Shantha Reddy Alonso. She has served as Executive Director of Creation Justice Ministry since 2015, and her work has been featured in The Hill, the Colorado Gazette, The Day, Sojourners, Pathos, Grist, NPR, Religion News Service, U.S. Catholic, and various podcasts. Shanta has arranged numerous stakeholder meetings between people of faith and their policymakers, as well as testified before the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the U.S. Department of Interior, and the White House Office of Management and Budget. Next, we have Huda Alkoff. She is an ecologist, environmental educator, and the founder and director of Wisconsin Green Muslims, a grassroots group formed in 2005 to connect faith, environmental justice, and sustainability through education and service. The group has launched widely implemented programs such as the Green Ramadan campaign and the Energy Democracy Faith Communities for Equitable Solar Initiative. Huda has spent 2 decades working as an advocate for environmental justice, initiating Muslim and interfaith programs focused on energy and water conservation, and has received numerous honors for her work. We also have joining us the Reverend Dr. Gerald Durley. He is the Pastor Emeritus of Providence Missionary Baptist Church. He is a civil rights icon who marched with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. during the 1960s. As a pastor, Reverend Durley became intensely involved in the climate change and environmental justice movement, and he now combines the disciplines of faith and science with the lessons he learned as a civil and human rights advocate from the 1960s. We also have joining us Natasha Reed Rice. She serves as the Associate General Counsel for Real Estate and Finance at Habitat for Humanity International, where she works to enable Habitat affiliates to provide decent, affordable housing to families throughout the United States. Natasha is also the founder of Fresh Rain for Life Ministries and is currently partnering with All Saints Episcopal Church to launch the Faith in the City series. Natasha is passionate about providing a voice to the voiceless and opportunities to communities that have been historically disadvantaged. And last but not least, we have Dr. Mark Douglas. He is a professor of Christian ethics and director of Masters of Divinity program at Columbia Theological Seminary. He has had numerous publications, including his most recent book entitled Christian Pacifism for an Environmental Age. He is a founding member and director of the Earth Covenant Network and founding editor of the online journal, At This Point, Theological Investigations in Church and Culture. Dr. Douglas is currently researching and writing at the intersection of environmental issues and conflict studies. Welcome to all. To set the tone for our conversation, I am going to ask Reverend Durley to lead us in a brief prayer.
It is such an honor to be with all of these distinguished experts. And we thank God for yet another day. We thank God for a day that is a celebration of 50 years of those who fought for the environment. But before we go to God in prayer, we certainly want to remember all of those who lost loved ones and are in the hospitals with this insidious disease, coronavirus. So God, we lift them up today. Eternal and almighty, divine, righteous God, the giver of every good, perfect and excellent gift. It is once again, because of your sovereignty, you brought us together to discuss something that means so much to so many all over the world. We're looking at the environment. And God, we apologize for what we've done to a perfectly balanced ecological world that you put us in. We thank you, God, for this day where we could come together and learn and be informed and inspired to understand what it means to protect and sustain the climate. God, what it means for us to mitigate against all of the ills of sociological ills that are destroying this planet. God, we thank you for yet another day when we can come together and share through virtual communication the things that mean so much. When we look at where do we stand today, and we discuss with this panel, God, touch each one of them with your own inimitable way. Give them the wisdom to come from their experiences, to let their tongue ebb with the flow of wisdom so that we might find solutions to these answers. God, we thank you for giving us the faith that we know that we're on the right team at the right time for the right reason, so that we will not faint when we see all of the kinds of atrocities that are coming up against those of us who are trying to put the planet back in balance. God, we thank you. So as we go through this day, God, looking at the faith and the hope and the love, we ask that you would empower those who have this responsibility, that when we leave this place, we'll understand that we've learned something that will give us the indomitable power to move ahead and not faint and not bend and not back up, but speak truth to justice and truth to power, that we might continue to do what it is that you've called us to do. So bless this day. Bless each one of the persons that's listening and watching, so that when they finish today, that they will leave with a new imperative that they must do something to keep your planet balanced. And we ask it all in the name of all of the powerful prophets that have ever talked about keeping the world safe. In all those names we pray. Amen.
Amen. Amen. Thank you so much, Reverend Early. Okay, so I want to just say that in my own faith tradition, that I am aware that before there were any commandments, thou shalt this, thou shalt not that, before there was the 10 Commandments, before there was even prayer or praise and worship that's referenced in the Bible, my faith tradition, the very first commandment or mandate that God gave man was take care of this creation. Take care of the birds in the air. Take care of the fish in the sea. Take care of this creation. And somehow we have gotten away from that. And it wasn't even really taught to me growing up. And I grew up in the 80s pretty much. And so I'm so interested in having some real talk and real dialogue around the role of faith in climate change. So the first question that I have for the panelists, we will begin this, let's talk about the current state. Where are we today? The current state of climate change. If the 4 care for creation principles, and those 4 principles are stewardship, fair and equitable distribution of resources, ecosystem connectivity, and our way. If those 4 care creation principles represent the engine for progressive climate change, then where are we strong? Where are we weak? What is our biggest opportunity? What is our biggest threat? Now tell us in your own words, what do you see? And you can pick any bullet. And Natasha, I want to start with you because you do work in housing and communities. And from your perspective, what do you see?
Well, you know, especially in light of the COVID-19 moment, when we talk about pre-existing conditions, and often cases we're talking about pre-existing health conditions, but I think it's also important, especially on a day like today, to talk about pre-existing situational conditions that are often clearly linked to the environments in which our folks, many people in our communities are living. So when we see all of the numbers coming out, you know, African Americans have a higher incidence of death as it relates to the coronavirus. A lot of that, if you pay attention to where these populations live, they typically are living in more low-income areas where the environmental conditions in which they live are poor. We often say in my work in housing that housing is a vaccine. And the reason that we make that link between health and housing is because oftentimes in these low-income communities, there are higher incidence of asthma, higher incidences of heart disease, higher incidences of diabetes that could be tied directly to the environment in which many of these affordable properties are located. So they're often downwind from chemical plants. They're often literally on the wrong side of the track, where there perhaps had been some other environmental issue that may not be fully remediated, right? And so they're living in areas where the land is more affordable because the land is not is not located in prime, safe, environmental areas. And so that ties very much into fair and equitable distribution of resources. When we look at the care for creation principles, right? When we look at the issue of environmental equity, you can see how it breaks down along areas of class, along areas of race, how it inordinately impacts families that are living in environmental conditions that are substandard. And that obviously links to housing. It links to a pre-existing condition that makes them more vulnerable to something like a coronavirus pandemic. They have less access to adequate health care because of where they're located, less access to adequate transit because of where they're located. All of those components play a part when we look at how we plan our cities, how we plan out our communities, who is relegated to subpar environmental conditions because of their income or the color of their skin. All those types of questions are things that I think we have to bring to the table when we begin to have these conversations about environmental justice and look at the 4 principles of care for creation.
That's great. And you referenced environmental justice. Dr. Durling, I know that that's a passion point for you. What is your perspective on where we are?
Yeah, I think Reverend Natasha has summed up many of the issues that we talked about. But I've looked at this over the years, starting off from the civil rights and the eco-justice point of view. We realized that in 1960, in the 60 Olympics and the 60s, that when it came to the civil and human rights, that everybody had a constitutional right to buy homes where they could afford, where they could ride on the buses. That was a constitutional right. And in the environmental movement today, it is a constitutional right that everyone should have clean water and access to toxic-free air. But right now that's being denied for many of the reasons that Natasha talked about earlier. So we've got to apply many of the same principles when it comes to trying to find an equitable place when it comes to justice issues, particularly when you see so many waste dumps put in, toxic waste dumps placed in our neighborhood, and the streams that are being polluted in many of the states where we reside, where the low and income and rural people are. So we've got to now come together as one to look at the legislative process and the kinds of issues that are being placed before us at the policy levels, where they're putting profits above people. Some kind of way, those of us on this call and those of us who are listening, is that we've got to coalesce and collaborate together to be a strong force to speak justice to these issues. Because right now we realize that many of the isms that are separating us from the constitutional rights that we so richly deserve. So I think it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to get involved. I think one of the strongest factors that we look at now is that people are becoming more aware of what it is that's going on in society. When we look at the raging wildfires, when we look at the tsunamis, when we look at earthquakes, we see that this is real. So now we have an obligation, as we did during the civil rights movement, to not only organize, strategize, but now mobilize. And I think one of the strengths is that the young people are beginning to break down lines across intergenerational lines where we work together. And that's where justice can really come in, because for us to move in the civil rights movement, we had to have all nationalities, all races, all cultures, and all generations to come together. And I see that beginning to happen right now as we face this crisis, this climate crisis.
That's great. And I'm glad that you referenced that you're seeing maybe that silver lining, the strength is in our young people. And we're certainly going to talk more about generating that pipeline of leaders a little later in the conversation. Mark, what about you? You have a unique perspective as well with equity, justice, policy. What are your thoughts?
Right. Well, first of all, I'm grateful to be here, and thank you for inviting me and letting me participate. And thanks to Reverend Rice and Reverend Durley for kind of teeing me up so that I can talk a little bit about kind of where I work. In some ways, I am the harbinger of terrible news in my research and writing, because I write and research at the intersection of one wicked problem, which is climate change, and another wicked problem, which is war, and how those two things actually exacerbate each other. So I just deal with really bleak stuff all the time, and it's lovely, just fantastic to hear people like Reverend Rice and Reverend Durley and everybody that's on this call envisioning a future that's better instead of one that's worse, because I keep seeing the worst side of things. Let me kind of just preface that. One thing that I would suggest here is that we are all on the planet impacted by environmental catastrophe, climate change, the catastrophic loss of biodiversity, the exponential growth of pollutants, but we are not equally affected and we are not equitably affected. Moreover, I think it's really important for us as we start to imagine what ecosystem connectivity means to recognize that it does not consist simply of how human beings interact with each other around the world, but how they interact with the rest of the non-human natural world along the way. So there are these deep questions for me about how we take the best insights that we are gaining about the pursuit of equity, about the pursuit of justice, and apply them even beyond the interhuman and political worlds in which we live, and use those political resources that we have to start to reshape how the disequal inequalities manifest around the world. That is to say, where climate change impacts people at very low elevations, people on islands that are disappearing, that's going to demand one type of response from us. Where climate change shapes ocean acidification and loss of resources for persons who live on the benefits of those oceans, that's going to shape another type of response. For where climate change is shaping the expansion of desertification and the growth of wildfires and the trouble of growing crops, that's going to shape another type of environmental change. And then if you start to look at what I deal with, where all of these things are fomenting violence, that's going to shape yet another response. And so when I think about matters of equity and justice, part of what I want us to do is think incredibly expansively about how to pay attention not only to the costs being borne in particular places and disproportionately by various groups of people, but also how the costs are being borne in the larger non-human natural world. And attention to the need to pay attention to those costs actually funds the possibility of responding and adapting to make the world more livable for human beings as well as the rest of the non-human natural world.
Wow. Does anybody have any questions or response to that? I mean, well, I will just say when I hear you speak, Dr. Douglas, the question I have in my mind is how long will it be before, you know, we really have, we don't have a food source, a quality food source anymore. I mean, so can you put that in perspective in terms of, you know, if we don't course correct some of these issues that you've outlined, we're all going to be endangered. So, I mean, how much time do we have?
What a great question, because there are so many variables into the mix of that. We don't know how fast technological change is going to advance. We look at what happened in the last half of the 20th century in the Green Revolution in India that took a place where there was going to be significant famine and changed things so there was not. So there's always some possibilities of technology. At the same time, technology is also an exacerbator of problems. To bring about change technologically is, for instance, to use lots of energy, which creates another type of kind of unequal inequality. Who has energy and who doesn't? What type of energy do they have and what type do they not? So one variable is where does the technology lie? Another variable is what does population look like? The UN says right now we're looking at what, 9 to 10 billion people by 2050. That's another 2 billion on top of what we have right now. How are we going to feed those people? The result is that there are so many variables that it would be difficult to answer your question and say when this is going to happen. Moreover, it's important to kind of just look back in history and say what has been the case isn't that everybody has then all of a sudden struggled for food. What has been the case instead is that some people have had resources and others have not. So where inequality grows, it's likely to grow also with regard to basic goods as well as access to technology and the resources of the world.
I'd like to add something to that, Juliet, if at all possible. From a different perspective, I think Mark has put it right on the head, but how much time do we have? We have today. today is the time that we have to, a lot of times we think this is something that's far off into the future, but we're experiencing many of these calamities right now. So therefore, the answer to your question from not a prophetic way, but a way that we could say it every day to get people involved, because we now, if we're to really move toward mitigating this climate crisis, we've got to let people know that we have today, and that's the time, and that's what's so important, because a lot of people think it's something in the far distance. We are experiencing these disasters now, as he talked about the islands that are being submerged underwater, and what we're experiencing every day, the food shortages and the droughts. So all the time is really now, and if we can put that pressing psychological imperative into our minds, I think we can get much more done at the legislative and at the local level. If we know that we're in the midst of this right now, and there is really no time dispensation that we can waste.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think I could not agree more with Reverend Durley and Dr. Douglas. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to go in a slightly different direction, and I hope that it complements what we just heard and really get to kind of intent and our own egos when we talk about this conversation on environmental justice. I come from a family that settled in Snellville, Georgia, out of slavery. And they became stewards of their land. So my family, thanks to the foresight of my great-great-grandmother, who sold eggs and butter and was able to acquire 75 acres in Snellville, Georgia, became farmers. So I spent all my summers on dirt roads making mud pies. But in the course of that, I also was growing and learning my faith from my grandmother. And my faith learning from my grandmother was always connected to the farming and the land. So Dr. Douglas, when you say all of these non-human components, right? I learned of the oneness of all of God's creation, kind of hearing her talk about Farmer's Almanac, and when the moon was going to be full, and when, I wonder if it's going to rain. Well, if it rains, it's God's work. I mean, so many of us have heard that, right? We can't interfere with God's work. And that would lead us all to have to sit down in the house with lights off and everything unplugged because God was working with the storms. Y'all remember some of y'all may have experienced that as well. And don't talk too loud because you'll draw the lightning, kind of all that kind of talk about but I took that and became a real estate lawyer and practiced in Manhattan for a number of years. And I remember, and this is in no regard to downplay New York City, any New Yorkers on, it's wonderful. But I was so caught in this spiral of ego, really. I mean, imagine real estate in New York City. You're dealing with some of the biggest egos you could ever encounter. And one day I looked out of my 22nd floor window and saw only concrete and buildings and said, of course there's ego here because everything you see is man-made. In a city where you legislate where you put trees, right? You can have a flip of understanding where this was not God made, it was man made. And I think sometimes we get mistakenly egotistical about our place as humans on this earth and think that this is a man-made reality. This is not human made, this is God made. And when we step back and realize, oh, I'm a part of this whole cycle and ecosystem that God created, how can I be a value add to that? It shifts the way I think we approach this topic.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I'm thinking about the Jewish start of kind of thinking about environmental issues is Psalm 24. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Doesn't belong to us first. It belongs to God's first. And I think that's kind of what we mean by stewardship when we're thoughtful about it. It's not we're the stewards up here and then everything else is down there and we're in charge of it. Stewardship is to say it is God's. We are kind of charged with care, but we're in the same mix as the rest. And attentiveness grows by just being out in the natural world, whether growing up on a farm like you did and like I did, or just making sure you get out and experience the non-human natural world as a part of your life.
Yeah, and that just kind of goes back to, for me, as I listen to this, I go back to my own faith tradition. I was started out in the Baptist church, Ambrose, shout out to the Baptists, and then I evolved into other denominations. But, this whole notion of stewardship over the creation, this was not taught in my congregation. somehow, I missed that. We went straight to the 10 Commandments, or, again, the thou shalt this, or, don't do this, don't do that. But really, there was no reference to the responsibility that we all have to be good stewards over our creation. And that brings me to the faith piece. I think this is a good segue into the discussion of faith and what is the role of faith in creation care. So we've talked about where we are, the current state. And now I want to, drill it down a little bit more into, what we're seeing in our congregations and what the movement is there. And Huda, I want to start with you. Climate change creates losses and damages. So why is faith essential when it comes to climate change?
Yes, so I'm have some slides here. So I'm Huda Al-Kaf, founder director of Wisconsin Green Muslims, which is a grassroots environmental justice group that connects faith, environmental justice, sustainability, and healing through education and service. And next slide, please. Next one.
I'm sorry, Huda, I'm having a little trouble. Can you just repeat that?
Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So it is a duty and obligation on Muslims to care for Earth, our common home. God states in the Qur'an, the holy book for Muslims, chapter 6, verse 165, it is God who has made you viceroys on earth. The earth was mentioned more than 450 times in the Qur'an, of course for a reason. In Islam, there are clear teachings and signs about the important, beautiful, and intricate balance of creation. In the Quran, chapter 15, verse 19, God says, and the earth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, God says, and the earth we have spread out, set there on mountains, firm and immovable, and produce therein all kinds of things in due balance. The balance is a key word in Islam and a key concept in Islam, and our responsibility is to maintain the balance. Next slide. Prophet Muhammad, God's peace and blessings be upon him, is reported to have said, if doomsday is about to take place, while any one of us has a tree sapling in our hand, if we can cultivate, then cultivate it, for we will be rewarded. This message of active hope and deep courage inspires me. Personally, I strive to seek the light in the midst of every dark and difficult situation, including this time of climate disruption. As people of faith, every one of our religious traditions demands us to care for the most vulnerable amongst us, our neighbors, the strangers at our door. We know that at this moment we have to turn towards each other to stand together for justice. Next slide. And God has set up the balance of justice in order that you may not transgress due balance. So establish faith with justice and fall not short in the balance. It is God who has spread out the earth for all God's creatures. So again, this message is for all God's creatures, not human only. This is chapter 3, verse 108. These are the signs of God. We heard them to thee in truth, and God's means to no injustice to any of God's creatures. Across all faiths, we share a moral obligation to not harm others, to be fair, and to care for the vulnerable. Preventing damage to the global climate and alleviating the pain and suffering of the marginalized and vulnerable communities are a moral and religious duty and obligation. We are responsible to take care of Earth, our common home, and each other. So definitely climate change is a moral an ethical issue.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for that perspective. And one of the words that stood out to me was just the emphasis on balance, having balance in creation. Shanta, I want to transition over to you as an activist. In what ways can religious leaders further advance the creation care concepts in their temples, mosques, churches? Just even taking that theme of balance that Huda just referenced, how do we translate that, with the creation care concepts in our faith-based institutions?
Thanks for that question, Juliet, and thanks to all the panelists for the great conversation so far. I have 4 comments that I want to make on that topic. One is that we're in this together. Nobody walks alone. That's point number 1. And if you take nothing else from this conversation, that one's really important. 2, root your work in place. It's really important that we do this work understanding where we are. 3, break your big goals into smaller chunks, and the holy seasons are your friend in this regard. And then 4th, engage in regular practices and disciplines together. So let's start with we're in this together. I have noticed a trend among people who who care about creation, care, and justice in their communities. They tend to be lone wolves. If you see a lone wolf, join with them and create a pack. From a Christian perspective, this is a fundamental truth of who we are. In Matthew 18, we hear for those who gather in 2 or 3 in God's name, God is with them. So I would suggest that if you are starting from square one, really intentionally build a diverse team as you can within your faith community. Diversity is your strength. And if you collect all like the usual suspects who might get tagged as tree huggers, your cause will not go as far. Diversity of expertise, racial, ethnic, cultural background, and diversity of age, which is sometimes a blind spot as well. All of those are going to serve your cause really well. Another thing as you're forming your group is to spend some time together in realistic discernment about ambitious goals that are right for your community. And what the congregation next door is doing might not be right for yours. So there's no reason to keep up with others. Just find something that's right for your community and do that together. All right, point 2, root your group identity and shared listeners in the place where you are and respecting the people of that place. Senegalese activist Baba Diom once said, if you don't know where you are, then you don't know who you are. So one of the reasons that I believe we are in this ecological crisis is our placelessness, which is a symptom of our country's history as a resource colony. And so also we have to deal with the fact that in many of our religious traditions, our sacred texts are written about places that are not located in the places where we are. And for many of us, the Holy Land is somewhere far away, but we too are in a sacred place. We have to take the time to understand it. So learn about your watershed, learn about what species are your native neighbors. Doing this as a group is a really good group activity to get you started. Another reason we are in this crisis is racism. So in this country's effort to take resources away from indigenous peoples and force the labor of enslaved, displaced people of African descent and exploit labor of each wave of immigrants that came in, communities of color have been made expendable in our economic system, and it's devastating. It's why environmental racism persists today, and learning where communities are suffering from pollution is one of the core roles of any congregation's team that is going to take this work on. So the quality of the work, how you do the work, is just as important as the content of your work, and I cannot drive that home enough. So I would suggest that we are in a time when more and more people understand the current system and business as usual is not working, that racist colonial resource empire economics are not working for us. And so this is a great opportunity. This is a great time to be in this work. And as we have the context of adaptation for our conversation here in this town hall, in many ways, adapting does mean old is new. So restoring traditional ecological systems, traditional ways of ecological care is critical. And Reverend Natasha, I loved hearing the story of the ecological practices that you learned from your grandmother. Like, that is exactly what we need to learn about and get back to as communities for those of us who did not have a grandma like that. Those stories are really valuable to be shared widely. Rooting your work in local communities and truth telling about your local reality is going to ring true within your faith community and beyond. And it is also a profound spiritual exercise to go through together. Creation Justice Ministries, my organization, does offer some resources to help you do this. If that sounded overwhelming, we have some places where you can get some resources. So if you check out our educational resources page, we have some curricula on care for God's creatures and census plates. You can look up the idea of doing a BioBlitz citizen science project to learn about the species in your area. There's a lot of fun activities there. Okay, point number 3. Break big goals into smaller chunks using the holy seasons. The holy seasons will help you with this. So one natural way to do it for Christians, and we're a Christian organization, so I'll speak from my experience, is to leverage the opportunities of Ash Wednesday to talk about our connection to the soil. From dust to dust you shall return. During Lent, more and more people are taking on the discipline of a carbon fast or a tread lightly for Lent ecological discipline, where you take the 40 days of Lent and try to integrate new healthy habits for your household. For the Easter season is a season of joy. How are we using that time to take joy in God's creation? The season of creation, which is a newer spiritual season, is from September 1st to October 4th. It started in Orthodox Christian communities. September 1st is the beginning of their liturgical year, and they always have an encyclical on environmental issues at that time. And then Pope Francis adopted it, and now it seems to be proliferating all over churches, which is awesome. So September 1st is a day of prayer for creation, and then the last day of the season is October 4th, which many Christian communities use to honor St. Francis of Assisi, who's known as the patron saint of animals. And then the time in between, you can do sermon series, you can do a series of activities. If you check out seasonofcreation.org, tons of resources there. And then the Advent season with its apocalyptic theme, very timely for what we're going through right now. So leverage those holy seasons to break up the thematic work or the campaigns that you're engaging in. There are also secular seasons, like today, Earth Day, is something that we can use as a moment to bring a sacred and moral message to a wider community conversation, as we're trying to do through this town hall. The Creation Justice Ministries offers 52 ways to care for creation, which is a week-by-week guide for things that you can do with your faith community. It's on our resources page, and I encourage you to check that out. Accompanying that resource is also a monthly bulletin insert that breaks the ideas into month-by-month ideas that you can share with your congregation. All of that is ready-made for Christian communities from Creation Justice Ministries, so I offer you that. Number 4, last one, engage in regular practices such as taking a monthly action or visiting your congressional representative twice yearly. Create those rituals with your group and with your congregations that just come to respect. Oh, what's the monthly action this month? Or, oh, it's August recess again. Are we going to go visit our member of Congress? Creation Justice Ministries has a monthly action center at creationjustice.org/action that includes timely relevant events and education resources and action alerts to write to Congress or to the administration. So there is never nothing to do.
Great. What's your website, Shanta? You listed a lot. There were resources that you mentioned. So for everyone listening out there, for more information on that, what is that website, Shanta?
Creationjustice.org, and the action center is at /action. The educational resources, and there are a ton, /educational-resources.
Great. Creationjustice.org. Okay, got it. There, thank you so much. Reverend Ambrose, your role of greening churches, I love that. I've never heard that term before, and I mean, it's a very fresh perspective and definitely new in my world, but in your role of greening churches, with respect to your mission, your operations, maintenance, etc., how do we fully appreciate the earth in its abundance? And why should we care that it be preserved, especially in the absence of faith?
Thank you. Excellent question. Very glad to be here with all of the panelists. So excited about all of the good things that we are hearing. Yeah, so green the church is just that. We are attempting to green the church in general and the Black church in particular. The statement that you made, Ms. Hall, in terms of what you learned in a Baptist congregation may not sound as if you kind of heard some of these concepts growing up and things of that nature. So Green the Church attempts to tell the story that Dr. Rice told about kind of what is our language with the planet? Where is that? Where was that in the congregation? Surely all these grandmothers was in somebody's church somewhere. And so how is it that some of those messages have been laid down for us generationally as we move to these concrete jungles? Maybe not as such, and why is that? So Green the Church was formed to do three things in particular: to amplify green theology, right? To say kind of why and what does it have to do with our thoughts, our belief, our philosophy, our history, what does the Bible say? Then we promote sustainable practices, which is what most people think about within the name. We're going to bring the church, then let's make sure that our buildings run more efficient. Let's make sure that we're not as wasteful. Let's make sure that we are paying less on our light bills and things of that nature. And for the African American church, in the midst of communities that are already in trauma, like the trauma that the world is experiencing right now, is at times the answer to why the African American church is not getting down with climate change. Because what the world is experiencing now with COVID-19 and how it is so front and centered in our mind and our thinking for a lot of African American communities, we already live with that kind of trauma. We already live with a trauma that says death may be outside the door, a trauma that says you must protect the body at all costs. And so we have to talk about real quickly, what does this mean for us as a Black church? And so a lot of people enter this conversation through conversation around food, around health disparities. We enter the conversation around how to save some money. Come on, I need somebody to say, man. Amen. Thank you, there it is. This is our point of entry. Like, what are the practical things that can be helpful for us right now? Because our communities do face a lot of ongoing trauma. And then finally, we're into building power for political and economic change. We do believe that the church has always been the center for community change, and that whether it's economic empowerment, political empowerment, we understand that climate change is real. We also understand that there is a green energy future that is also happening, that there are great technologies, and that our children must be a part of science, technology, engineering, agriculture, arts, and mathematics. Like, we have to begin to talk about not what we are against, but what we are for. And we believe that this movement and where we are in the world right now gives us an opportunity to talk about not what we're going to march in the streets to be against, but what are we going to get in our own boardrooms and say, now, what are we for? What's our task of moving ahead? I will say that something struck me. When we talk about the African American community, we have to talk about this issue of faith, and getting back to the why theologically is because I think the core of African spirituality says that there is no dichotomy between the sacred and the secular. And I believe that a lot of those things have been forgotten. So to talk about greening the building is also to acknowledge the vastness of God, the vastness of divinity. And quite frankly, we have forgotten some of those things, and we need to be really renewed. Some of those stories of grandmother. I grew up, of course, I'm from Oakland, California, but my family's originally from Hollywood, Louisiana, down in the woods. And so there, those same stories of understanding farming, of understanding the earth, of having our shoes off, running around with our toes in that red clay. All of those things meant something to us and had a way of feeding who we are as people. A part of the throes of the Great Migration, some people left the country and said, I'm never going to be outside like that ever again. I'm never going to have to grow my own food ever again. And so we came into places at times wanting to forget some of those very things. And so we talk about why the conversations didn't come up in California, where I am. I'm vice president of the California Baptist Convention. I need somebody else to say, man, California Baptist Convention. And that convention,
hallelujah.
And that convention back in the 1950s, men and women who came here during wartime, who came in, somebody said they didn't come to California to go to church, but we had a lot of good church, but we came to work. We came to take responsibility. We worked in the shipyards and the canneries. We worked as construction builders, but in the midst of that, they purchased 120 acres of land in Fresno so that they could continue some of the practices of their elders. But by 1975, 1980, a lot of people wanted to forget that, because that meant that you were country, that meant that you may be backwards. And so, no, we said we want to go take our children to the nice hotels. So in our convention growing up in the 60s, 70s, young people would go to camp during the summer. But by the 80s, we closed the camp and we took the young people to the hotel in December, because we wanted to have what other folk had, right? And so we did not want to have responsibility for what it takes. And I think, again, I think that's an issue of our time. Spirituality is about taking responsibility. But taking responsibility is about empowerment. And for a lot of our communities, we are not looked upon to be or to have power. We are looked upon to be consumers. Our job in these urban centers, and even in the rural, I grew up again, in Louisiana, but even my cousins who still live in Shreveport, they'll tell you, I don't live in the country, I live in the city, right? It is that thing that we're trying to get behind. And I really don't say that despairingly, because for a lot of us, those communities came with a lot of pain. They came with a lot of things that we wanted to forget. So we talk about, the joy of planting and the joy of farming. But there's a difference between farming because I feel like it and farming because somebody else feels like it. It's a difference between farming and growing up and having the resources that I planted and those resources belonging to someone else. So how we feel about land, how we feel even about the animals, right? There are some people who just are uncomfortable around dogs. And you have to say, well, what is the epigenetics of that? What is it about who I am as a person and what happened in my history that may affect how comfortable I am in those surroundings? Some people find beauty in trees in the forest, but for some people, we start thinking about strange fruit, and we start thinking about the trees that we would have been on if we hadn't come to the city. And sometimes
let me just kind of I want to one of the things I want to go back to something that you said, Reverend Ambrose, just about consumerism, consumption, our behaviors around consumerism. And I just kind of want to take that concept and segue into where is the hope? Because really all of you have, have just really given us insight into where we are today, some of the
if I can just say doom and gloom of where we're headed. And I, as I listen to all of that, I mean, I hear a lot of symptoms that are all stemming from a root cause. What is that root cause? I don't know if we're just not kind to ourselves anymore. I know there's a correlation between, you know, if we're kind to ourselves, there's a likelihood we'll be kind to each other, we'll be kind to our creation. But I just want to talk about, where is the hope? Where are our leaders? Reverend Durley mentioned early on that one of the strengths that we have is in our young people today. And maybe they are, you know, the torch bearers and doing a better job of showing kindness to each other than maybe we are ourselves, you know, from my generation and older. But let's just talk about the hope piece, because this conversation, you know, it can get really dark, you know, and feel like it's, you know, the end of the world. So let's talk about, on the bright side, how do we train a generation of faith-based leaders to act as champions and torchbearers in the face of climate change? And what are some examples you've implemented in your own communities? Now, obviously, Reverend Ambrose, you mentioned, you know, the consumerism. So, you know, how do we train a generation of faith-based leaders to be champions in, you know, the human consumption and behaviors, or champions in technology, sustainable development, and policy? Dr. Mark Douglas, you know, how do we protect the most vulnerable? So, I mean, those are just some different areas of focus, but I mean, it's a broad question, but where do you see the hope? Where is the silver lining? And anybody can jump in on that. Well, I'll pick. All right, I'm gonna pick you, Reverend Natasha.
Okay. I would say simply, you know, for me, in the coronavirus moment that we're in, one of the things that occurred to me in the very first week of it is like, maybe, is this an opportunity for us to become humankind again? You know, with the kind in quotation marks, because it is forcing us all to be still in ways we have not, and maybe uncomfortable to us being still. So one of the things, for instance, for me, that I've been doing to try to continue to keep my hope alive is taking walks every day. For instance, things that I hadn't really had the time to do because my schedule was so fast. And what has given me the greatest hope is hearing the birds sing. The music of nature has reminded me that in the midst of all of this, God's creation continues. It has pointed me to the understanding of sovereignty. And it has reminded me that, you know, we're not on this earth in and of ourselves, right? That even in the midst of COVID, songs are still being created by the birds of the air, right? And of course, then there's all these scriptural references. Why is it that we worry if the birds themselves don't worry, right? How much more would God make sure to take care of us as he takes care of the birds and the lilies of the field? But it's also the reminder, there's a great book, Last Child in the Woods by Richard Louv, that came out some years ago. And he talks about how do we save our children from nature deficit disorder? And it ties in some to what you were saying, Reverend Ambrose, and what you were saying, Dr. Douglas, as well, that like when we're living in this consumerism, this fast-paced age, this age that doesn't take consideration for the natural evolution of things, right? How do we, so I read that, I heard of the book and started taking my kids camping every year. Because I'm like, we need no phones, you know, no technology. You need to see what happens when you put a seed in the ground and give it the time to grow, you know. And in the faith context, our faith is compared to a mustard seed, right? We're all these comparisons, and there's so many throughout the parables, throughout the Christian text, of the comparisons to an agricultural society, one that is based on farming, based on land, based on nature. And so I think one of the things that we need to do as we think about training a generation of faith-based leaders is really work to shape perspectives, shape theology, look at the systematic theology examples, look at the practice of our faith in the context of God's creation, and God's creation being something greater than a better bank account, a better car, a bigger house, those are not the signs of a blessed life. And really continuing to push to shift that paradigm of a blessed life is the opportunity to hear the songs of nature, to walk with God and God's creation, to, look at the natural processes, not the microwave prayer requests.
That's well said. Reverend Early, I think you're there. Are you still there? I think that I saw you, that you might be online. If not, okay. What about yes, Mark, Dr. Mark, what about you?
Yeah, I think one thing that I wanted to say is there's a tension we're creating even in the two questions as we're framing. One, where is hope, and one is how do we train the future generation. There's a real danger in pushing on to the next generation the responsibility of solving the problems that we have helped create. That is at the level of the kind of climate change, catastrophic loss of biodiversity, explosive growth of pollutants that we're facing, bigger than any people can solve. It just is, it's too monumental. I think the starting point of hope, at least as a person of faith, for me, is to remember that God has never left us bereft of God's presence, and that God makes promises and has kept promises and will continue to keep promises that ultimately are for the welfare of all of creation. And once I keep that in mind, it right sizes my sense of responsibility. Instead of saying I have to solve the world and its problems, to I have to figure out what God is doing and get on board with the size of work that I do, right? So I am responsive to what God is doing in the world, including, as Reverend Rice said, going out and hearing the way God is working in the natural world as birds are singing and nature comes back into places that it's been gone for a while just because of a short time of social distancing, right? Figure out what God is doing and then get on board with that. And don't worry about trying to be God to solve the big problems. God's going to have to do that because that's beyond our capacity to do.
That's good.
Amen. Amen. Shanta, I see you nodding your head. I want to give you an offering for that response. That was, I mean, because it takes the pressure, right? But you know what? But when you say it that way, it takes the pressure off of one person, because it can be so overwhelming. Thank you for that, Shanta. What do you say?
Yeah, so right along those lines, I would say that what's giving me hope are the people who are not saying, what's giving you hope? Being in this climate work, it's how can I help? The people who ask, how can I help? Are the ones that I see as giving me hope. There was Mr. Rogers who said, look for the helpers when things get tough. And I look at how these helpers are vessels of God's love in the world, and they're manifesting different gifts that we need in this time. We will plant the seeds. One inspiration that I get from Archbishop Oscar Romero from El Salvador, he once wrote that we plant the seeds that will one day grow, and we may never see what they turn into. We're prophets of a future not our own. And so things look very grim. And those of us who really look at the full picture of where we're at and the situation we're in, it can be very hard to convey to the average person when business as usual is to put our heads in the sand and just not face what's going on because it's too much to take in at once. And so just knowing that we're not alone, looking for the helpers, and for myself, being in community with some amazing people, being vessels of God in this really crazy time.
Excellent. So we have, there have been some questions that have come from the audience, but before we get to those, questions, let's just, I want each of you to leave us with one adaptation practice an individual can take to positively affect climate change. So, we've talked about, where we are today, current state. We've talked about the role of faith. We've talked about where's the hope. Now, how do we express our love? How do we express our kindness and our love, which leads to action? So, just one.
Juliet, can you hear me?
Yes. Is this Huda?
Yeah, this is Huda, yes. So I would
good.
like to share. Can you hear me well?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, so this is a model I want to share for Wisconsin Green Muslims. This model works for us. It ties with the leadership training model that we've been working on. So
Okay.
for 15 years now, we've been like dividing the whole year into different themes. So each month is a theme, so climate change, water, Interfaith Earth Month in April, Green Ramadan is coming now, April, May, Organic Fair Trade in May, Community Vegetable Garden this summer, Transit Equity, September, October, Energy Awareness Month, Waste Reduction, November, Environmental Justice, December. So this way it gives us connection with it's an open circle, and we are able to connect, support, partner, collaborate with diverse constituencies and welcome them joining our open circle at the point of entry that matches their interest. And it keeps the hope alive whenever like a new theme that we're working on and a new interest that people are connecting with. And we connect it all with climate change in all aspects. So next slide. Just some of our team members here. Next slide. We have youth, we have religious leaders, we have women, we have all over. And the messages we all tie with the teachings in the Qur'an and the teachings of the prophets. So water is a sacred gift and sacred trust. And so the message is do not waste it. And so how we can like always put that in front of us. Next slide. So adaptation. So what we do with our Muslim communities, like green infrastructure. So this is to alleviate flooding. So this is one of our projects at a mosque where green roof, so to improve water quality and reduce the volume rate and temperature of stormwater runoff within Wilson Park Creek and the Kinnickinnic River. This green roof is at a school. It's a middle school and high school where the classrooms windows overlook this roof. So it's part of the curriculum as well as so this the building of leadership as well as also protecting the neighborhoods from stormwater. Next slide. And the elementary school we converted the asphalt to green space in the parking lot and then put in rain gardens where the kids can learn about the native habitats, native plants, celebrate the butterflies, and so it's part of the curriculum and building leadership. So that's how we tie both aspects. And next slide. I want to also mention that we're celebrating this month the Interfaith Earth Month. So we have a poster design contest, and this is the winner for last year. So this is she drew this poster for we have a Muslim and a Christian both united and planting trees and watering them together. So that's also part of our teachings and celebration of interfaith work, because this is what we need to do. We cannot do it alone, as we already said. So we have to do it together. And so this is part of our connection and leadership and adaptation practices. Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Huda. Thanks for sharing that. I love that picture at the end there, just bringing together the two different faith traditions. So let's before we...
You were talking about
love.
You're
back.
Yes, I apologize. I had to, as some of you on the call, I had to speak at Earth 2020X, and it was a wonderful gathering. But you talked about love. And in our tradition, we say that love casts out all fear. And when we talk about climate change, and there's so much fear because of the ignorance that we don't know about what it is and what it means, and are there any solutions? But love, the Bible says that love casts out all fear. So those of us in the community, in the faith community, particularly the Christian community, we've got to use our love to remove the kind of ignorance. And once we remove ignorance, we replace it with faith. And it's the faith to believe that God is still in control of all of that we're encountered with. So our role from faith is to understand that as long as we can continue to talk about that God gave us the not fear, but a faith and of a sound mind and discipline, we can use that in mitigating the kinds of things that we see. So many times when I'm out here, people don't know what it means. Why is this happening to us? And I think the role of the faith community, and particularly during this time, is to demonstrate to people that God is still in control. We've fallen prey to profits over people with the fossil burning fuel industry and all this. And so we've got to now not only combine our love, but also what it is that we do when we leave our pulpits or our beamers or whatever our faith tradition might be, to put our legislative voice together and make a difference. And that is fueled by the love for one another. But you cannot love one another unless we connect the dots to love the climate, to love the environment, to love the bees that pollinate, to love all of God's perfectly balanced world. And I think when we do that, then love takes on a real manifestation and a real meaning in our day-to-day lives. And that's what I think was missing so many times as we tried to promulgate why the environmental movement is so important. We've lost the sense of the real gut level issues where the people are. And I think those on this call have taken the academic side, the scientific side, political side, and the business side, and brought it back to where people are. And people want to love, and people want to be connected, and that love will give us the impetus to move ahead and do what we have to do to bring the climate back into balance, the environment back into balance. To remove our fear, and fear is based on ignorance. So we're about removing the ignorance that keeps us locked into our own little silos of loneliness and hopelessness.
Mm-hmm. Dr. Mark, what is your take on one adaptation practice that an individual can take to positively affect climate change?
Right. So I'm going to cheat and give you two. One is personal, and it's really fast to say, and that is plant a tree. Trees are signals for the future. But the other is political, because a lot of the things that we deal with can't be solved by people acting individually. They have to be done corporately. And so the things I'm going to suggest, the practice I'm going to suggest that are really important are work for voting rights to expand the number of people that can vote, work for voting equity so that people's votes count the same, and teach people to vote based on gratitude for all that they have been provided, and on behalf of all those who will be coming after them. If they can do those things, more people voting, better equality in voting, and vote on behalf of others, then I think we're in the type of place where we can actually shape policies that are good for the earth.
Shanta?
Yeah, thanks. I just want to build off of that. In addition to voting in every election with those values, the accompaniment of public policymakers with compassion as well as strong accountability. They're hearing often from powerful lobbies that are ignoring our ecological crisis because that's not profitable for them, and they need to hear from caring people who just are doing their everyday thing, and it might not occur to them to build a relationship with their policymaker, but that is critical right now. We have to adapt our public policy systems to our actual reality instead of the profit margins of a few companies.
And Reverend Natasha, would you like to add to that?
Sure. I'll start also by saying this has been wonderful. I've learned so much. Shanta, thank you for the many practices you've already given us that I think are very practical and doable. And Huda, thank you for yours as well. The one adaptation practice, other than those that Dr. Mark already shared, which I feel like he took my words, he took my one, is get educated about this issue. You know, one of the biggest issues I think in this climate change conversation are the ignorant voices that are trying to lead the conversation. And so I think I would suggest that we become more educated about what is climate change? What does it mean? How does it affect my local community, my state, my nation, our world?
Thank you. And Reverend Ambrose, did we lose him? Is he there? No, okay. All right. So thank you so much for those perspectives. And let's try to I want to get a few questions in here that have come from our audience, our virtual audience. And this one is from Richard Kearney. The question or the comment, not all spiritual people choose to join a religion or faith community. So how do we find ways of appealing to the non-church goers in our communities? Who would like to take that? Reverend Durley, are you there? You want to
Yeah,
answer
I'm
that?
here. Yeah, and I think it's a matter of respect, because everybody has different kind of belief perspectives. And I think when we can respect the different traditions, over the years, I've seen people who claim just to be Christian and always Christian, or Muslim or always Jewish. But I think when we can respect a person that has a particular faith belief, and then also agnostics, and that's what they firmly believe. And we're all on this journey of life, and we have different perspectives at different times. So I think if a person is a non-believer from a faith tradition, that we need to respect them, what their virtues are, and we'll find out that we have more in common than we have in our differences, and how things come together. And I think that that's going to be key, that we respect the differences and the diversity from our particular perspectives of belief.
Very good. Any other perspectives, Shanta?
Yeah, so I would go back to my point about building community where you can find it. So don't be a lone wolf. Find your pack. It doesn't mean you have to do it in a congregation if that's not the setting for you. But during this weird COVID-19 era, we have more access than ever to virtual community and the ability to find people who resonate with the things that we would like to do, and then we can manifest those relationships in our local communities. So I think it's possible to find community without necessarily being a joiner of that community.
Okay, good. Okay, here's another question. And this question comes from Maggie Favretti. And this question is around education. All right, can we all work together to focus education on our grand challenges? Community and place-based problem solving gives tools to all to deepen their learning and add purpose and resilience to youth and communities, starting now. Many places doing this already, and I think we all agree with that. And I know, Reverend Natasha, you focused a lot on education, or you mentioned education, and of course you're heavily into the communities. Do you want to just expand on that comment?
I mean, other than to say absolutely. I mean, you know, I think it's important, and I liked what Shanta said about find community where you are, you know, so obviously, especially if this question is coming, how do you do the educating as a leader? Understand your audience, right? Understand your generational differences within your audience, as well as your faith differences. And so how you communicate the information, I think, is so important in how it's conveyed. And also, like Dr. Mark said earlier, the information should also be conveyed without condemnation, you know, because it's kind of hard to begin that conversation by wagging your finger, but say this is actually an opportunity for all of us to come together to make a difference in our own lives and in our world. And we can, and also setting in the education space as it translates then into action or your faith into love, set short-term, medium-term, and long-term goals. Because if you hit some of those short-term goals along the way, you show the success of community quickly, it gains momentum. And it encourages folks to stay on board and say, oh, we can actually make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Very good. Dr. Mark, I'm going to give this question to you. This is from Liz Goust. And her question is, are any of you working in communities impacted by extreme weather, such as severe flooding, and talking about how to adapt? Do people need to move inland? And how are you framing conversations about this?
So personally, I am not. Atlanta actually is in a remarkably good place, recognizing all places are vulnerable. There are no non-vulnerable places anymore. But there are people who are living in vulnerable places, and they are writing some of the best stuff. And there are people in the majority world, especially, that are doing remarkable work of activism on environmental stuff. I increasingly look to the majority world for the best insights about how to address some of the worst effects of climate change and the catastrophic loss of biodiversity, because they are more immediately being affected and they're more directly engaged along the way. So look to global partners and voices along the way.
Okay. Very good. Anybody else would like to add to that? Shanta, where do you live? are you yeah, I don't think
I recently moved from the Washington D.C. area to Indio, California. So we're in wildfire zone as well as drought. Drought's a real concern around here, and I'm still learning how the local community is approaching those issues, but they are imminent.
Okay. All right. Here's a question from Charlie Barlow Jr. What is the interfaith community's response to the transformation taking place? What role can chaplains and the Office of Chaplaincy play to support the care creation principles? So what can chaplains do? Anybody, Reverend Natasha, would you like to go first?
You know, I was actually going to say that's right up Reverend Durley's alley.
Well, Reverend Durley, are you there? Where are you? Okay.
No, I think, and it goes back to some of the remarks that others were saying, that when you go into the chaplaincy, whether it's the military or the hospital chaplaincy, you learn and you grow to appreciate the differences. For example, if in an interfaith area for the last, I guess, 20 years in World Pilgrims, we've been working with Muslims, Christians, and Jews going to places of worship. And when you find that a person who is Christian can appreciate the Juma prayers, and you can go into a Jewish temple and appreciate Shabbat services, then you begin to understand the differences from a theological perspective, but from an overall worshiping from a faith perspective, there's a lot that we have in common. So when it comes to the environment, I've not only read what the Torah has said, but also what the Bible is saying, and other holy books are written, and they all pretty much are saying the same thing: take care of God's perfectly balanced ecological world. And there's another level of appreciation when you can see not only the differences but find the commonalities. And chaplains certainly have to do that because they're working across all different faiths, and so that's why it's so important that they study and find out the differences, and then find out the commonalities. And then there's a strength when they're speaking to whoever they're addressing at that time.
Yeah, and this is for that. I want to add to that. Yeah. So can I go previous slide, please? Yeah, so this is an initiative that Wisconsin Green Muslims is leading, and it's called Faithful Rainwater Harvesting. And the abbreviation of it is Farah, which is it's an Arabic word for joy. So this is an interfaith initiative. It's led by Wisconsin Green Muslims. It's interfaith, and it's connected with more than 18 different traditions, faith traditions, and spiritualities. Water is definitely a medium, a teacher that connects people from different backgrounds. And it's really, we've found it a very rich and healing aspect of water that brings people together and connects us. And we have those three components. We have the social component where we have peer learnings around water, how we can appreciate water, how we can really, it's a sacred gift, sacred trust. So this peer learning of how we harvest rainwater and celebrate it in different ways. Financial component where we educate the community about different models of how they can do green infrastructure. But the spiritual aspect, which is also really, it's not tied to any faith, because we find the message, the commons, we really focus on the commons. Water is the commons. No one owns it, and everyone should have responsible access to it. And we just want to increase our appreciation to it. So we found this really initiative as a healing aspect of it. It's a gathering aspect, connector, and a teacher. So that's been really a wonderful interfaith example that we have in Wisconsin.
And water is a key element, whether we're using baptism in the Christian church or in the Jewish tradition. So if we can talk around a theme just around water, we can find the commonalities of our faith and how they come together.
The one thing that I would want to throw out in the middle of that is that honoring things we have in common shouldn't mean that we only pay attention to the few things we have in common. We don't want kind of a common denominator where we all talk about the only things that we can talk about in common. What we want is to celebrate the diversity and the variety of approaches, especially when in a time when we are looking for new solutions, new approaches. The range of possible approaches actually makes it more likely we'll be able to address them. So to let people come clearly in all of their diversity as they are, and not limit the conversations to, well, these are the things that we all share, so this is the only stuff we'll talk about, but celebrate the diversity there in the middle of that.
No, I'd like to add to that to enhance it. In fact, when you can understand the differences, then you can appreciate the diversity. And I think that's what you're leading toward, Mark, because it's not everybody agreeing on everything, but I think when I can understand where you are, then I can appreciate where you are. Then I can appreciate your diversity as I look at where I am. I think that's what you were leading to. Not everybody singing out of the same hymn book, but we're singing a song, but we see the differences in the notes, but we come together in harmony so I can appreciate why you do this, and why you can appreciate why I do this, and then we're stronger in why we do things together.
Right. Can I say one thing on that? And diversity is natural. When we talk about nature, diversity is natural. Yeah. No two leaves are the same, no trees are the same. I mean, when you look at the nature that has been created, it is diverse.
Yeah, thank you. And then I'm gonna try to squeeze in this last question, Shanta. I want you to close us out with this one. This is from Almi Mansaray. Hope I pronounced your name right. What are ways young people can get involved to mitigate the climate crisis and give back to our communities? And Shanta, you're an activist, so answer that question.
Yeah, so I think young people are really skilled networkers, and also young people are very good at motivating people who love them to pay attention to the climate crisis. And so I would encourage young people to use your platform as communicators and connectors, to talk to your family about how you are seeking to protect your future, and you need allies in doing that, and mobilize them. There are some groups that I think are doing this really well. If you want to look at some examples, the Our Children's Trust climate change lawsuit has some youth plaintiffs who have sued the government for depriving them of their ability to pursue life, liberty, and happiness. And they have become really strong spokespeople from a young person perspective. The Youth Climate Strikes movement has grown and become really diverse. And I know there are a fair amount of faith participants in that movement that have articulated faith messages that are not too hard to find with Google. So I would definitely point to those things. But I think that young people are very good at shaking us out of our apathy and helping us see things more clearly. And you have the circles of influence as young people to do that through your faith communities and your families.
And one other question too, and that way I can get every question that came through. This came from Andrew Hartley, and he's asking a question around resources. And Shanta, I know you provide a lot of resources, but his question is specific to: have resources been developed for promoting among Christians the interests of non-human living things? Can you speak to that? Do you provide resources around that, or anybody else on the panel? Oh,
so in addition to the, so this is Shanta. In addition to the resources that I shared online, so our Care for God's Creatures resource and our Endangered Species resource, I would also definitely encourage that you check out some organizations that are working on this. The St. Francis Alliance is a group of Catholics that works on non-human creation issues. And then there's also a ecumenical Christian organization called Creature Kind that we partner with that specifically focuses on farmed animal issues. And I think, Mark, you also know the work of David Clough. He's a great theologian who does that work.
Yeah, that's actually what I was going to point to. And I tried to answer Andrew's question in the chat to point at David Clough, who's done work on a kind of a systematic theology of animals and found in creation kind, or creature kind rather. So those are good insight good starting places to me. And David's knowledge is encyclopedic. So even if you don't kind of get satisfied with him, you can figure out in his footnotes where else to go.
All right, thank you so much. Well, y'all, it is 3:30. We answered all of the questions from our audience, and I just want to say thank you to all of the panelists. This has been very enriching conversation. This concludes our town hall conversation. Thanks again, and we hope that all of you in the virtual audience are informed and inspired to do your part in advancing the care for creation. Thanks again, be safe, and I'm going to just turn this over to Molly.
Thank you, Juliet. And yes, thank you to all our panelists for joining us today. This was an incredible discussion, and I'm definitely leaving very inspired to go take some action too. So thank you all. Just a reminder, this was brought to you by Global Adaptation Month. So if you are inspired to go implement a project in your community, you can visit our website and share that with us, www.globaladaptationmonth.org. And there's also, because our panelists are so involved, which we're so fortunate to have had them today, there are some other events that we wanted to share out with you guys before you go. So for Global Adaptation Month, we have one more webinar coming up next Tuesday, and this one is specifically focusing on discussing the impacts of the recent EPA COVID-19 deregulation order on frontline communities, and then identifying ways to move forward in the face of climate change with that additional problem. And also, Huda wanted to share, and Reverend Dr. Durley have a partnership coming up. If you want to give a couple words on that, Huda?
Yes, tomorrow we're having a short conversation with both Reverend Durley and myself around celebrating Green Ramadan, which is the holy month for Muslims. It begins tomorrow evening. And the Faith Climate Action Week that's led by Interfaith Power and Light. And we're also both contributors to this book, Rooted and Rising, Voices of Courage in the Time of Climate Crisis. So we're going to share our essays and our stories. Celebrating interfaith collaboration. And this is Green Ramadan, our campaign that's 15 years now, starting tomorrow evening for a month. So all on our website, discountinggreenmuslims.org. Thank you.
Thanks. And then also Reverend Dr. Ambrose Carroll has a webinar coming up tonight called Black, Green, and Traumatized, and that's going to address the intersection of environmental justice and mental health in the African American community with solutions towards avenues of equity in the COVID-19 and climate justice era. Do any of our other panelists have an event they want to share? Shanta, do you want to say something?
I do. For the Christians in the community, on Monday, April 27th, there will be advocacy opportunity on faithful response to the COVID-19 stimulus package that's now moving through Congress. You can find out more at advocacydays.org.
Thank you.
Looking at the environmental justice implications for the infrastructure proposal.
Fantastic. This was one other thing is that this was a part of the Faith Call to Climate Justice Web Summit as a part of Earth Day. We were featured on this event, and I recommend going to that link. There have a bunch of other amazing sessions they're featuring in regards to the faith-based climate action movement, and you can, for the next 3 days, there's tons of things happening. So that's the final thing I want to share with you all. And, Reverend Durley?
No, I wanted to thank the panelists for a great job that they've done, and particularly we need to just applaud you, Juliet Hall. You did a marvelous job of putting us together and keeping it straight and moving it in a timely manner. And Molly, I really want to thank you because they didn't see what you were doing behind the scenes to move me around today. And I really applaud you. You need to give credit where credit is due. Thank you so much. This is the day that God has made. We'll rejoice and stay focused. We will not bend, we will not bow, we will not break, and we're on the winning team.
Amen.
Amen.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you all, everyone. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye all.